we've talked about fractals and resonance and integrity. So what I'd like to do now is talk about how these three very important concepts all fit together, because they're actually different ways of understanding the one central theme, which is the importance of us being who we really are. So obviously the work that I do is called Fractology. Now that involves being able to perceive the underlying pattern of our energy, or consciousness if you prefer, which is indeed a fractal pattern, just like the Sierpinski snowflake that we were talking about in the last episode. So you can think of it in a way like the old-fashioned light bulbs that had the little light filament in it. So in our light filament, in our light bulb, there was like a little electrical wire, and even though there was all this light coming off the light globe, it was actually the filament that was producing the energy. And in many ways, this is what our fractal is. Our fractal is like the filament. We have all this energy. We have heard about auras and the possibly Kirlian photography, which is actually capable of taking an image of some of this energy, and yet it is the underlying fractal that is producing this. Now, how does a fractal and integrity work together? Well, when a fractal pattern is exactly like this, it's all the same pattern. But what happens if we introduce a different kind of pattern? So instead of all of this being a triangle, what if one of these starts to actually instead be a square? Or what if some part of the pattern starts to follow a different rule? So instead of moving on the outside like this, what if it moves on the inside and just starts to build on like that? So it's still triangular, but it's following a different rule. Now, when this happens, we get a distortion in our energy. Now, we all instinctively understand that this is not a good thing. So, as I said, I was doing some pruning. So here's a couple of examples from the garden. So here's a cutting. Now you can see very clearly, you know, this is a basic pattern. We've got these green leaves, and we can see here where the poor things ended up with some kind of bug. These leaves are not the same pattern as these leaves. Now, I don't need to be a botanist to know that that's a sign of some kind of trouble. So here we have a break or a distortion to the pattern. So there's something going on here that doesn't follow our basic rule. And here's another example, just from nature, from my prunings. So here, this little thing, which is a Japanese maple, some of the jasmine from next door has been growing in. And see, we can see that although both of these patterns are fine in themselves, because this pattern looks quite healthy, like the jasmine pattern looks quite healthy, and the Japanese maple pattern looks quite healthy, but we know that this pattern here is not the same as this pattern. Now I will be talking a little bit later in one of the later episodes about codependency, and in many ways energetically this is exactly what we get with codependency. We end up almost trying to follow a different pattern to our own. So when we have integrity, you know, we don't have this kind of thing going on. We're all, you know, we're sticking to the one pattern. And in many ways, I suppose you could think of, you know, healing or therapy as about we're rebooting the underlying pattern. So that's integrity and resonance. Now, integrity and fractals. Now, where does resonance come into it? Well, remember that we were talking about resonance with our laser as being all the same. So this has got more to do with the way our light filament, our fractal, is being activated. Because when this is being activated in the most effective way, this is the kind of energy that we have. And what that means is all of this gets activated all at once. Now, this kind of understanding that in order for this to happen all at once, see, remember that when we talked about integrity comes from the word integer, but part of that root meaning means in touch, like every part of it is connected to every other part of it. Now, when it's all the same pattern like this, and we don't have those distortions that we were talking about before, we can understand how this works together. And so if all of this turns on together, it's working together, we are more likely to get a resonance like this. We're not so likely to get a light bulb that's in effect flickering. Now, we're just starting to understand this, for example, with the brain. See, it's an interesting thing that a lot of our technology, of course, it comes from our understanding of how things work. So currently our computers are, they have this binomial code. So it's a whole series of ones and zeros. Now, that actually comes from the brain of understanding like neurons. That's basically roughly what a neuron looks like under a microscope. So you have a cell, and the way that they understand it is this tells the next neuron. I'm getting a bit complicated here. To turn off or on. So this is like this. It's because each one of these ones or zeros is telling the circuit in the computer, turn off, turn on, turn off, turn on. And that's exactly how we've first started to understand the brain. But we are beginning to understand that actually the brain works a little bit more like this. Now, I haven't quite got to the point of really understanding the fractal patterning of the brain, but they are actually understanding that the brain, gosh, this is getting very complicated, all up here. They are beginning to understand that the brain, so if we draw roughly brain, they're actually starting to understand that it isn't just about, this neuron turning on this neuron, turning on this neuron, but it's actually about the whole pattern. Like, do we have an activation pattern like that in the brain, or do we have an activation pattern more like that? So in other words, they are starting to understand that it's actually the whole pattern of firing, not just individual patterns. Now, when we develop technology that reflects this, I believe we will get to fractal technology. But so all of these things are very much connected, and we're going to be exploring a little bit more of this in the next episode, where I'm going to be talking about holograms.